Sarah, you may begin.
Thank you. As we told you in the beginning, this case revolves around people making decisions and reactions under pressure. Before you got to meet Stacy, you were painted a picture of a predator in every sense of the word. In their opening, they called her a vicious and violent murderer, a person who randomly decides to kill a stranger while driving in a car where there was nothing but, quote, good vibes, who stabs a man 5 times and then looks, quote, glowing, quote, refreshed, and, quote, excited before going back and getting more and stabbing him more. A person who is so deranged that after stabbing someone to death, they lick their hands with their blood, with the other person's blood, all over it, tasting another human's blood and saying, quote, his blood tastes dirty. A domestic violence batterer who hit their partner with a car 3 different times, held a knife to her throat, beat her, caused cuts all over her body, and who threatened her children's lives. A serial killer who killed 3 to 4 other people and then burned their bodies to get away with it. And now also a gang member in an unknown California gang. Someone who's really into fires and steals their murdered victims' belongings to just burn them later. And now a person who apparently lies under oath about having social anxiety. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to remind you about what Mr. Perelia told you in the beginning, about that quote he gave you. Let us take things as we find them. Let's not attempt to distort them as to what they are not. Every aspect of this case has been the prosecution attempting to distort who and what Stacy is as a person, to dehumanize her and make her into a vicious and violent murderer. It's much easier to get a conviction on first-degree murder if you distort who someone is and then you stand up here and yell about how evil they are. But you got to hear her. You got to hear from her. You got to see her. When Stacy described to you going to Hosanna's grandmother's house later in the morning of October 3rd, she described getting sick again. But this as a physical reaction to the trauma she had just lived through. She described going into her spare bedroom and not being able to sleep, just laying there, thinking about the nightmare that had just unfolded. And when asked, did you have any other kind of physical reaction that night to what happened? She said, no. I just wanted to be with my mom. I just wanted to be with my mom. Does that sound like a person to you who forms the intent and desire to take a stranger's life in the backseat of a car? Who plots to get him drunker as part of some sort of apparent overall scheme to get the physical overhand, to make it easier to kill him for the purpose of stabbing him in the neck 5 times? Does that sound like a person who viciously and violently and unjustifiably murders someone? And does that sound like someone to you who later writes their brother and says they don't believe they can ever be happy again? Does a vicious and violent murderer turn to their older brother and say, quote, I'm literally going through the hardest part of my life and I don't know if I want to keep going? Does a vicious and violent murderer become so traumatized by what happened that before they're arrested, they describe not being able to sleep to their older brother because, quote, every time I close my eyes, I see him? No. No. During opening statements, the prosecution previewed Dr. Burson's testimony and argued that this was an intentional killing, first-degree murder, because each stab wound was in the neck region and all directed in a location where Stacy knew there were arteries. Remember that? Do not let them distort. Let us take things how we find them. She was a 19-year-old girl who had dropped out of high school as a freshman, 14 years old, to work and take care of her mother. She doesn't even have a GED. And you saw her and you heard her. When asked whether the night at the Clarion was a noteworthy moment in her relationship with Hosanna, she said, "I don't know what that word means." She didn't know what the word noteworthy meant. When asked if she knew the basic idea or concept behind fight or flight, no. That's not someone who knows what an artery is, let alone plotting to get this guy drunk and pick the precise anatomical location where she knew it would cause a massive bleeding and ultimate death. That's not what we have here, folks. Instead, the location of each stab wound, the weapon that was used, how the weapon was used and left behind, is all consistent with a fast, unplanned, and instinctive action. Now, as we all know, first-degree murder is the most serious crime anyone in this state can be accused of. As it should, a conviction of first-degree murder demands that the prosecution be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt not only that the person was killed, not only that there was specific intent to kill, but also the added layer and that killing came also after deliberation. After deliberation, it's not up for interpretation. That definition about what the law tells you they have to prove is in your jury instructions. And it's not any less of an element than the fact that someone died here. Every element weighs the same. And the term after deliberation means that they have to prove Stacy decided to kill Mr. Dickerson after the exercise of reflection and judgment. The law tells you this cannot be a quick, momentary, one thought after another type of thing. In fact, the law prohibits a conviction for first-degree murder if it was committed in a hasty or impulsive manner. Think about what those words mean. Think about the synonyms for those words. Hasty, speedy, hurried, rushed. Think about the synonyms for impulsive, spontaneous, instinctive, unthinking, reflex, knee-jerk. Every single aspect of this case, every single piece of physical evidence concerning Mr. Dickerson's death tells you beyond all doubt that this was quick and it was hasty, and that it was an instinctive response to the imminent threat that Stacy was facing, an instinctive response to save herself. Take this metal shiv. This is not a traditional weapon. This isn't her bringing a weapon to this guy's house to plot and plan, to feed him alcohol, to take advantage of him, to get him drunk. This isn't hers. And make no mistake, if Hosanna Varela had the ability to tell you or show you that she had seen Miss Rodriguez with that thing before, or if they could have done that, they would have. If the prosecution had the ability to bring in a single witness who could tell you that they knew that Stacy had that item or a similar item, or if they found a Facebook picture or a conversation that had anything to do about a shiv or a weapon like that, you all would have heard that and seen that. Nor did Stacy introduce that metal shiv at the moment things escalated and Mr. Dickerson got physical. Even Hosanna had to admit, albeit with a completely different version, that she was the one who introduced that shiv and the point where things were escalated and conflict was ensuing. And notice how she minimized her culpability, right? When admitting that. Oh, Stacy directed me. Stacy told me to go get it. The reality is that she is the one who introduced that weapon into the situation. And when Mr. Dickerson grabbed the metal shiv while being over Stacy, not letting go while she is pleading with him, it all happened so fast. And as we discussed way back in jury and selection, and these types of moments, they aren't planned out. No one plans for this very moment. She had split seconds to react. There was no appreciable amount of time to exercise careful reflection and judgment. There wasn't. She told you, quote, he grabs it, and then I'm obviously trying my hardest to just leave. She described using both hands on his one hand that held that metal shiv. I kept hitting his hands on the floor so he could let it go. I wasn't strong enough to get it out of his hand with the one, but I was just trying to hit it out of his hands. Both of her hands on his one. And in those split seconds, when she breaks free from his grasp, he pushed her in the face, consistently trying to grab at her. And she instinctively fought back. Again, there was no time, no appreciable time for reflection and judgment. It cannot be one thought after another. It was hasty and it was fast. It was impulsive and it was instinctive. It had to be. She told you in your own words. Were you looking at him? No, I wasn't. I wasn't looking while I was doing it. At that moment, I didn't think anything, and then he was still continuing to grab me. So I kept kicking him and I sat up, and that's when it happened again and it broke. Quote, I didn't know that I'd hit him. She didn't even know that she had made contact until reviewing discovery and saw that she did it 5 times. She wasn't looking at his direction. She was too focused on trying to get away. So when they're questioning her yesterday, what were you looking at? Of course she's not going to be able to tell you. Her only thought in that moment was self-preservation. Stacy described falling when she was trying to get up as they were fighting over the shiv and it breaking, which is consistent with Dr. Burson's testimony that he believed the metal shiv had a handle that had been broken off. Again, every single aspect, every single piece of physical evidence concerning Mr. Dickerson's death tells you beyond all doubt that it was hasty and quick, that it was instinctive, and an instinctive response to an immediate threat. What deliberate, intentional, and premeditated murderer leaves the weapon behind in the body? She went through all of this to try and escape, apparently getting caught and planning this murder and feeding him full of drinks. Why would she leave that in his body? Dr. Burson, with over 14 years of experience, the Weld County coroner, who has conducted thousands of autopsies, told you he has never had a case where a knife or a metal object was left in the body. Why? Because you don't intentionally kill someone unless you want to get caught and leave behind the weapon. If you go through the trouble of burning a house down to avoid getting caught for intentionally killing someone else after deliberation, after time to allow for exercise of judgment and reflection, you don't leave it behind. Now, the part of the metal shiv that was used also corroborates what Stacy told you. The prosecution wants you to believe that Mr. Dickerson was vulnerable, that this was a vicious, violent attack on an unconscious and vulnerable person. But then they also want you to believe Hosanna Varela, right? They want you to believe Hosanna Varela, who told Mr. Burroughs through her proffer that after Mr. Dickerson was hit in the head with the bottle, he had blood in his eyes, fear in his eyes, and yelled at them to get out of his house. So if they want you to believe Hosanna, he wasn't unconscious. But if true, Mr. Dickerson was knocked unconscious between the high BAC and the bottle smashed on his head, why wouldn't you use the sharp end? If the prosecution just stood here and told you that he was laying unconscious on the couch with his neck vulnerable, why would she use the blunt end? Why would she risk that injury to herself? And her goal and her entire purpose for all of this was to kill him. You don't use the blunt end. Stacy had to use the blunt end. And she had to because it wasn't intentional. This wasn't a decision made after careful reflection and judgment. He had the metal shiv in his hands. We know that. So when she was finally able to grab it from him, again, this is the sharp part of the pen, the pink part. That's the sharp part. We know he had it in his hands because otherwise, she grabbed it from him and had the blunt end. When she was finally able to grab it from him, it meant that the sharp end that was the threat to her landed in her palms. And she didn't even have a split second to flip it over before she had to use it. It doesn't get any hastier. It just doesn't. It doesn't get any more impulsive, and it doesn't get any more instinctive. This was an instinctive response to an imminent threat of Mr. Dickerson being on top of her, of not letting her go, pushing her, and having that weapon in his hands and in her face. She didn't even have the split second. Flip it over. And the wounds that Dr. Burson saw are also evidence of this and are consistent with Stacy's testimony. Dr. Burson testified that all 5 wounds were in close proximity of each other, less than 1 inch. That to him, that means that all 5 wounds were done in, quote, rapid succession and in a short period of time. Rapid, hasty, not first-degree murder. Dr. Burson described 4 of the stab wounds being in the front area, around the Adam's apple, and being from front to back. And the last one, the one with the shiv still in it, being in a slightly different location that also had a movement path of front to back, but also slightly right to left. During cross-examination of Ms. Rodriguez, the prosecution used the analogy of a dartboard. and said, well, what are the odds that you could hit the same exact spot while not looking? Well, ladies and gentlemen, difference being, you're not standing a few inches, a mere inch or two from a dartboard. A dartboard is not grabbing you. The front to back aspect of those 4 stab wounds are consistent with Stacy's description of the close proximity of their physical struggle. Him in her face with this weapon, him on top of her, and that last wound being consistent with Stacy describing not knowing that she had hit him until the object broke because he's grabbing at her. The right to left nature of that last wound is consistent with him moving his head to the left as he's pushing forward, trying to get her. There was no evidence that Mr. Dickerson, in light of those 4 stab wounds, would have not been able to be a threat to Stacy. Still grabbing at her. Instead, the only evidence you all heard was the exact opposite. Dr. Burson testified that Mr. Dickerson would not have been immediately incapacitated. Sarah Erfer, the toxicologist, explained that the other scientific explanation behind Mr. Dickerson's ability to keep moving, keep grabbing, still being a threat. She explained that alcohol has an analgesic effect, a pain-killing effect. Alcohol impacts a person's ability to receive pain. She explained to you that science tells us that as a person's alcohol consumption and BAC increases, so does that affect on their pain tolerance. And in that moment when the metal shiv broke and Stacy realized that she had made contact with him, she explained to you that Mr. Dickerson was no longer moving. Remember, she described scooting back, sitting there, just looking at her hand, frozen. She didn't intend for any of this to happen. Why would she? And while the prosecution doesn't need to prove motive, they don't. They still have to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that it was her conscious objective to kill him that night. Why? Why would she do that? Why do you kill a random stranger? For what? And notice their theory just keeps changing, right? It's because at first she's irately jealous that Chris had the audacity to ask Hosanna where she worked and not her. But then it turns into on the way back from the car, according to Hosanna Varela, she just decided to randomly kill someone when they're all having good vibes listening to the music. And then it changes again to this like weird intent to rob, right? Well, that doesn't make sense either, because if you go through all this trouble to poison this guy, to get him weak, to rob him, why do you not take the laptop sitting in the living room that you heard was found burnt and melted to a backpack? Why don't you take any of the 8 other gift cards in his wallet? Why don't you take a dime from his bank account that has 43 grand sitting in it? Why do you take what you take and then just burn it if you believe Hosanna Varela? None of this is true. It's all made up. None of it is true. And why would she want to do this? You heard her talking to her brother afterwards as part of a Facebook message, telling him that she just missed her old life and her happiness that she had before Hosanna, before October 3rd. Why would she choose this, any of this? Or is it more logical that none of this was planned? Is it more logical that none of this was wanted, and instead this was hasty and impulsive, an instinctual response to an imminent threat that she was facing? And as we talked about back in jury selection many, many times, it's the totality of the circumstances, right? How many times back then did we talk about how we wish you could have had all the facts, and as we're posing these hypotheticals, right? Now you have all them. And it's the totality of those facts and those circumstances that you have to consider in leading up to that split-second decision that she had to make. Consider, she's at a complete stranger's house in the middle of the night when the rest of the world sleeps. The complete stranger is a man who is nearly double her age. That complete stranger is a man who's nearly a foot taller than she is. A complete stranger who is clearly intoxicated, who lied to them about having an after party or having a roommate be present and clearly was not as the night progressed, who chose to wear a shirt out that evening that read, quote, straight out of fucks. Both Stacy and Hosanna described him as being touchy. Hosanna telling Mr. Burroughs that he seemed off, seemed different, seemed weird. How many times did she tell Mr. Burroughs during the proffer that she just wanted to go home, that she was uncomfortable? And of course that changes later in the proffer, and we'll get to that. You know, when she says, oh, actually, he was a nice guy. Like, that's not what they want to hear. They don't want to hear about how uncomfortable she was. And then this complete drunk stranger takes out this unusual weapon, something that looks like a prison shiv, to Miss Rodriguez.
Objection.
All right, and the objection?
Our prior records.
This
All
was already
right,
testified
can the
to.
parties approach?
Mr. Dickerson's state of mind going out that evening. He painted a rosy picture of him, you know, and good money in the bank, and, you know, he had some job interviews. Why are we completely ignoring the fact that everyone, neighbors, roommates, former coworkers, everyone knew this guy was pissed off that he had just gotten fired after months of a contentious relationship with his employer? And then at 36 years old, you go out by yourself to downtown bars in Greeley. You don't interact with anyone. You stand there watching people dancing at these clubs to the point that when the officers go back and they're like, hey, we're investigating this case, the person at Cubetta's is like, hey, I got a video for you because this guy stood out to me. It was weird. And when the prosecution tells you that there's no evidence that he was the initial aggressor, that is not true. That is not true. That is blatantly false. By all accounts, he was the initial aggressor. When he stood over Miss Rodriguez, putting both hands over her. You don't have to touch someone. You do not have to touch someone to not be the initial aggressor. Or sorry, let me take that back. You do not have to touch someone and you can still be the initial aggressor. As we discussed in jury selection, who the initial aggressor is matters as to whether or not you get to stand your ground and take another's life to save your own. And by all accounts here, Chris Dickerson was the initial aggressor. That's completely undisputed. And imagine the fear pulsating as she felt his alcohol-infused breath. Remember her describing that to you? As she's physically trapped underneath him, unable to move, feeling the spit of his anger landing on her face. That's not something you forget. As he's yelling at her, "Did you call me a bitch?" And in that moment alone, she is justified in using self-defense. She did not have any duty to retreat. We talked about that over and over and over again during jury selection. She tried to, though. She tried to. She pushed him away. She tried to get out of that house. But when he grabbed at Hosanna, it escalated things. She described it escalating when she is trying to get away as he's grabbing at Hosanna and she's struggling to open the front door in that moment of panic and fear. When she tries to interfere with him grabbing at Hosanna, it enrages him again, and he shoved her onto the couch. Both hands. His body on top of hers, pinning her arms down, struggling, unable to leave. And at this moment, even before Hosanna interjects that metal shiv, Stacy told you that her only thought in that moment was, quote, "He's gonna fuck me up." And even at that moment, she is legally justified in using self-defense, drunk or not. And remember, the law of self-defense authorizes you to use deadly force to take another's life in a wide variety of potential situations with a variety of potential injuries. I'm not going to go through all the jury instructions, but read carefully instructions 16 through 25. 16 and 25 tells you that the law recognizes this need for self-preservation can be necessary under a host of different situations with a variety of different injuries. So look carefully at what constitute first and second degree assault, because you are legally justified in taking another person's life if you believe any one of those assaults could be happening to you. And look at first degree assault means intending to cause and causing serious bodily injury with a deadly weapon. Serious bodily injury includes a penetrating knife wound, risk of serious permanent disfigurement. Stab wound would certainly qualify for that, right? Then there's second degree assault, bodily injury with a deadly weapon. Stacy was without a doubt reasonable for believing she was going to, at a minimum, receive bodily injury. Bodily injury is a very specific definition. It's in your packet. Any kind of physical pain. Any physical pain by that thing. Then there's second degree assault, reckless, which means at a minimum, when Mr. Dickerson grabbed that shiv in that moment of conflict and put it in her face, she had every reason to believe he recklessly could have caused her serious bodily injury. Permanent disfigurement, stab, the bare minimum. It is reasonable for her to think when that is in her face, he's on top of her, that he recklessly could give her serious bodily injury, at the very minimum. And then when he had that metal shiv in his hand, she doesn't just forget about everything that had just happened. She doesn't forget that he's bragging to her about using that thing to hurt other people. Again, she has only seconds to act. It was fast, and it was hasty, and it was instinctive. The degree of force was reasonable. What else was she going to do? You heard her. She wasn't intending to stab anyone. You heard that she wasn't even looking in his direction. Had Mr. Dickerson been stabbed 20, 50, 30 times, okay. But as she told you, she didn't even realize that it happened, that she had made contact until she fell and it broke. And then he stopped moving. And we want to talk about her credibility. Ladies and gentlemen, she could have gotten up there and told you all that she was stone cold sober, right? They don't have any evidence of anything opposite of that. They don't. She could have got up here and said, you know what, guys, I was completely sober. I didn't drink anything that night. But that's not what she did. She admitted to you that she was drinking to the point that she threw up a couple times. But common sense tells you when those things happen, when you're feeling someone else's spit and anger land on your face, you remember those moments, right? They don't have any problem with Hosanna Varela, right? Who was also intoxicated that night. They're not telling you, well, you know, yeah, Miss Varela is not that credible, right? That's not what they're saying. So why is it okay for Miss Varela to be intoxicated and yet be able to give you play-by-play details, but Stacy can't? Ladies and gentlemen, if the law does tell you that if you believe for a second, that Stacy's actions were not made after some appreciable length of time to allow for that deliberation, to allow for that reflection, to allow for that judgment, then it is your duty, your right, and your obligation to return a verdict of not guilty. And honestly, the only evidence that there was intent, that there was deliberation, there was time for reflection and judgment comes from the words of Hosanna Varela. That's it. You heard Mr. Burrows testify. They didn't have any evidence of what happened in that house. And during the judge's opening remarks to you and in those jury instructions as well, you were told, you all are the people and ultimate finders of fact and judges of credibility. You have to consider, as the judge told you, that it is your responsibility as jurors to decide what testimony to believe, and that decision should be made with a consideration of the motivation and the manner in which each witness might be affected by the verdict. Now, when Hosanna was arrested, we saw it. We've seen these videos multiple times. We know she wasn't planning it. We know that she was not planning on that Wednesday afternoon to being ripped from her kid's life. Just to be clear, no one at this table is saying, hey, jury, think Hosanna is a liar because she had the audacity to lie to her children about being on vacation. No. Any mom would do that. Any parent would do that. They're missing the point. We played those jail phone calls between Hosanna and her children so you could hear what she had to hear. You heard those children's voices. You heard her voice cracking in response. Mommy, when are you coming home? Those children's voices are gut-wrenching. And they're not even our kids, right? Imagine being in Hosanna's shoes and hearing that every single time you talk to your child. Your little ones. One's still in diaper. That would make, and the whole point of having you guys listen to that was that would make any parent want to do anything that they could to get out of jail, probably just short of trying to dig their way through those cement blocks with their own bare fingers. Any parent in that situation would do exactly what Hosanna did. Anything and everything to get out of her situation and back to those kids. Imagine the desperate and unbearable amount of guilt and pain that she felt. And Javi, her sweetheart, he wasn't her high school sweetheart, certainly wasn't making it easier on her, right? When he's talking to her, he's saying things like, what do you want me to do if you fuck yourself? Giving her doses of reality. What if you don't come home? We can't tell the kids that you're on vacation forever. They're gonna figure it out. And then she hears about things like him taking their son for a haircut and him randomly saying, Mommy's not coming home. And ladies and gentlemen, she hears that days and weeks and months go by. She can't bond out. Reality is setting into her that she cannot fix this situation. Those court dates come and those court dates go. And she's in the jail on first-degree murder charges. Let's not lose sight of her being charged with it as well. And she also has this whole other added layer of misery, right? You heard that she wrote her sister on May 10th saying, quote, it's been hard. I feel like a damn animal. Like, this is inhumane. I literally cannot be around anyone, talk to anyone. When I come out of my cell, it's like walking into another cell. I can't even see the daylight. At this point, she's missed Christmas with her kids. She's missed birthdays. She missed her firstborn's kindergarten graduation. And she tells Javi in a letter saying, I missed all these milestones and him graduating kindergarten being one of them. And I'll never be able to have that memory with him. And on the other hand, she's also seen Discovery, don't forget. She knows that they have her dead to rights there at Mr. Dickerson's house. She knows that they have her on camera at minimum, right? Going into that house. She also knows that it's her fault that she interjected that weapon. And honestly, heard she was drunk. She probably went to get it to help Stacy. Mr. Dickerson grabbed it because he probably thought the worst as well, right? But all Stacy knew was that she was pinned on the couch underneath this guy who had this in her face. And Hosanna is sitting in jail for 8 months with all of this weighing on her shoulders. And there's nothing she can do. She can't bond out until there is, right? And we don't know how this proffer came to be. We don't know who reached out to who, her attorneys or the prosecution. We know, though, that her sister Hannah was the one who initially explained to her this concept, this idea of giving information to the police to get time off her sentence. We also know that the guards reinforce that that is a real thing that happens. Sorry. And talk about using logic. If Hosanna did nothing wrong, right, then why did she wait until the proffer to share any of this information, right? And the reality is, she did it to benefit herself. In her level of desperation is clear as day from the drastic and illogical extremes she went through to paint Stacy as evil. Deciding to kill Mr. Dickerson randomly in the back of a car, well, otherwise there was good vibes. And you heard that wasn't even mentioned. She didn't even tell Mr. Burroughs that during the initial 43 minutes of her narration of her proffer. It wasn't until after she went back and after she talked to her attorney for 30 minutes and she came back and said, oh, Mr. Burroughs, in the middle of you asking me about how many times Mr. Dickerson slapped my butt, I just remembered that I'd asked her, at what point did you decide to kill this guy? And she was like, oh yeah, in the back of the car where I was listening to the music. That doesn't make any sense. She knew that they needed that information. You're telling me that her lawyers weren't like, hey, first-degree murder means X, Y, and Z. Of course they did. And then there's the bit about feeding Mr. Dickerson shots of vodka while taking shots of water. And although then she backtracked and said she didn't know if it was water, but just knew it didn't really taste like alcohol, so she assumed it was water. Water and vodka don't taste anything alike. You don't get those two things confused, right? Then there's this going back to wait in the kitchen, and like, as you saw the pictures, there's this little wall separating just a few feet away, and she's hearing what she describes as bone and rubber, and then describing Stacy coming in, taking a break, and looking glowing, refreshed, and excited. And then there's the extreme about drinking another person's blood and saying, oh, his blood tasted dirty. Do you think that girl, that 19-year-old girl, is down there licking her hands after just killing this person saying, his blood tastes dirty? That did not happen. That is completely illogically made up. And then there's a bit about her describing catching Stacy dramatically staring at her own hands in the car, her blood-soaked hands, and then Hosanna playing it off as cool that Stacy had told her that she had killed 3 to 4 other people, and so cool that she told Stacy that she kind of knew. Stacy responded, oh, really? And Hosanna said, yeah, well, yeah. Like one was telling the other that they didn't like each other's cooking. That didn't happen. And they know this is not true. They know it's not true. They know there's no other murders. There's no other murders. And I know they're going to come up here and say to you, well, it only matters that Hosanna believed it was true, right? Because that's why she didn't go to the police. But if that's true, then why on earth would Hosanna, a mother, allow Stacy near her children immediately afterwards? Why would she let her children pose with Stacy when they're trick-or-treating in downtown Greeley? Why would she tell her, hey, can you watch my kid? And then you saw that text message exchange. Any parent knows that that is just not based in reality. And if it had even an ounce of truth to it, just an ounce, then when she got those jail letters that they've told you about over and over again, that claim that Stacy wrote and that is threatening her children in it, that if she believed any of this for an ounce, and if it's true, then you know what you do. You go to those deputies in the jail and you say, my kids, their lives are at risk by this crazed serial killer who I just saw drinking blood from a stranger after she just murdered him. That's what you do. Or at the very least, if you don't trust police, right? You tell your legal team and they go to the police. And you heard her repeatedly tell you, I gave this information to my legal team. Then where's any of the police reports? Where's any of those officers who investigated this? Where's any action by her legal team to look into this? Because they knew it's not true. You make up these gross exaggerations because it's a lot easier to face and explain things to your children, to your family, and to the court when you come back for a reconsideration if you paint the other person as downright evil and yourself as a collateral victim. That's what she did. And those drastic and unreal extremes continued when she was confronted with the completely nonsensical and absurd response that she had to any of this that happened on October 3rd. First of all, it is patently absurd that you would watch someone kill someone else, lick their blood, go into a bedroom with them, and then point out a gun to them. Remember, she testified that she went around to the bedstand and was like, hey, Stacy, look, a gun. Why would you do that if you had just witnessed all of this? It is patently absurd that someone would witness this vicious and unnecessary and unjustified killing and then go sit in the car outside of the house and just wait by themselves to play Uber driver afterwards. No, you drive off. You immediately leave and you go to the police or you go somewhere. You don't stay. And it is patently absurd that someone would sit in the car with their cell phone, with their phone. Okay, you don't trust police. I get that. But you text your sister, who's your best friend, who you were just texting with 2 to 3 hours beforehand, sending them a picture saying, oh my God, we're at this random guy's house. You text Javi, you communicate with someone. It is also patently absurd that someone would sit in the car and wait for a vicious, violent, and unjustified killer to come back out so you can bring them to your grandmother's house. And we know they went there. It matches Dickerson's phone. And it is absurd, so absurd, that even during her proffer, that was one of the very few things Mr. Burroughs actually called her out on. He gave her a heads up that that was going to be a hard question that she was going to be asked and needed to come up with an answer for. She did, right? But even that answer just runs afoul to logic and common sense. She told you that the abuse, quote, got worse after Mr. Dickerson's death, and that's why she didn't go to police. And I agree with Mr. McCormick. This case, this trial, way deviated away from Mr. Dickerson and what happened. But who did that? These guys, right? We didn't. Hosanna said that the abuse got worse after Mr. Dickerson's death, and that's why she didn't go to the police. Ladies and gentlemen, worse than being hit by a car 3 times? Worse than being hit and being flung after you've been chased through an open field? Worse than when you have a knife to your throat and you're being punched in the face and you have cuts all over your body? And if that is true, if that's true, Detective Burroughs told you over 51,000 pictures on that woman's phone. She even admitted she loves taking selfies. Where is a single picture of any of those injuries? You heard about getting not one, not two, but 3 different types of records from her phone. 2 Cellbrite dumps, iCloud, not one single picture of an injury. You heard about also Facebook messages. You've seen a ton of messages between those two. And common sense, experience, reasoning tells us we know what domestic violence communication looks like. You know there's the period of gaslighting, the recognition of doing wrong, causing some sort of harm, some sort of disagreement. Thousands of messages back and forth between these 2 women, and not a single one was presented to you that backs up what Hosanna is saying about domestic violence. And common sense tells you if someone goes through the process of planning, of taking these diary notes to document this domestic violence, why wouldn't she take a single picture of herself? Not one? And we also know that Hosanna told Detective Burrows that during the proffer that at one point her daughter came in while she was changing in the bathroom and she saw bruises and cuts all over her mom's body and said, "Mommy, what happened?" And that Hosanna told Detective Burrows that her mother at one point also asked about the bruise. We know again that she's incredibly close with her sister. Yet the prosecution did not bring a single one of those people in to testify that they saw anything, ever, because it didn't happen. You even heard about them getting pulled over, right? Remember the October 25th is the diary entry with the knife to the throat that she says she was punched and clothes were cut off. She told Mr. Burrows it happened a week before her deceased father's birthday on October 25th. Yet, October 23rd, they get pulled over. Where's that police officer who comes in, who's a trained professional, who knows the signs and symptoms, who isn't just going to turn their back when they see a woman with a black eye? Where's those officers? Instead, the only picture of domestic violence you saw was her face completely covered in blood. And you heard from her best friend since 7th grade who saw Stacy show up at her door after running from Hosanna. Now, the prosecution can ask Ms. Varela, or they did, are you some sort of mastermind? Kind of joke about and gloss over these diaries that she wrote. But it's a fact, ladies and gentlemen, a fact that not one single diary documenting domestic violence came until after October 3rd, when Mr. Dickerson died. And Hosanna actually kind of slipped up at one point, right? Because she earlier testified and admitted that she wrote those knowing the investigation was going on. She even mentioned seeing about the house being burned down in the media. A house is burnt down. You know that there's going to be some sort of investigation about it. And then that changes, right? Because when I confronted her with the fact of one of those messengers saying something about the truck being hot, right, and her not wanting her kids in it, then that changes, right? And she changed it to a different reason of saying, well, that the truck was hot for a different reason, but that she couldn't articulate why. And if Hosanna Varela started to write these diary notes truly because she was afraid that Stacy was going to kill her, and because of domestic violence, why is there not a single entry from before October 3rd when she told Mr. Burrows that the summer of 2021, the abuse got worse? But we had to bring in the rest of those messages, right? We had to question her about that. Like the one on June 26, 2021 that said, quote, "I love Stacy. She's helped me through things no one ever could have." She's seen me at my worst. She saved me, and saved me is capitalized. She was there when I felt alone. Only her. She would stay up and actually listen and care. She helped me through so much. And instead, the only complaints that she documented in any of those diary notes, any of them from before October 3rd, was the one on July 11th when she's complaining about the audacity that this 19-year-old promised her that she would work 3 jobs to support her, clean her house, take care of her, and didn't. What a true reflection of the dynamic of their relationship, right? And then there's this also argument that, well, Hosanna says she wasn't afraid of being killed herself, but she was afraid that she was going to kill Javi, and also because Stacy's so jealous, and that's why she killed someone, right? All this jealousy. That's the other reason why we're here. Then how do you explain Defense Exhibit RR and SS? Remember, those are the snapshots where Stacy knows Hosanna is going to have sex with Javi. Is she jealous? Is she killing Javi? Is Javi dead? No. Stacy just says, I put some condoms in your bag. Be careful. That's not consistent with their theme and theory, right? And it also shows you how subservient she is to Hosanna. Think about, at 19 years old, you're in your first relationship, and you know this person is cheating on you. And all you say is, just be careful, here's some condoms. Ms. Rodriguez is not on trial for domestic violence. She's not. She's not charged with it, which one could argue they believe everything that Hosanna has said. Why isn't she charged with that as well, right? And collectively, if any of Hosanna's claims concerning Stacy's threats to her or Javi were true, any of it is true, you would have seen evidence of it, and you didn't. It's just her word. In every instance of Hosanna, or every instance of domestic violence that Hosanna described to Mr. Burrows during her proffer of domestic violence involved her being drunk. It's very clear this woman had a serious drinking problem. She even wrote it in her diaries about using Coke 4 times a week and being drunk all the time. And what's really concerning about that is the fact that as she's describing to Mr. Burrows during the proffer of all of these instances of domestic violence, she leads him to believe that one of those included that night at the Clarion. And you heard her testify that she had read the police reports from that night. She knew that not to be true. She knew that the police went back, pulled the video surveillance, and see her heavily, heavily intoxicated, stumbling, falling face first into a radiator on the wall, when Stacy's over here trying to help her walk in. She knew that that wasn't true, and yet she goes into that proffer and says, Mr. Officer, let me tell you about this instance of domestic violence. Then there's also her dramatic claim of, well, I couldn't even move a finger, right? She couldn't go to the police. She couldn't do anything because she couldn't move a finger without Stacy being there. She told Mr. Burrows, and she told you about these times where Stacy was waiting outside of Hobbies, where she was waiting outside the street, and there was a dramatic claim about her even going to Human Being and Stacy having a tracker on her phone. Remember that? And how Stacy went back to Human Being and asked the person how many coffees she drank. None of that's true. And you know that's true because we showed you screenshot, Facebook messages where clearly the two women were not together after October 3rd. Even in her own words, when she kind of slips up because she says, well, I had nothing to do with the burning of the items because I took Stacy's Tahoe And I drove to the gas station, got me some Mountain Dew, got me a snack, and went for a ride. Took my time before I went home. Don't forget also, there's a time where an Evans police officer texts her, right? Texts her and says about an unrelated case. Does she respond to them then? We know Stacy's not watching her phone because, again, if the whole theory is that this woman is so crazed and jealous that she kills someone for merely giving Hosanna more attention, then don't you think Mr. Mob Trujillo would be dead when Hosanna is doing nothing but texting him after seeing Mr. Dickerson's death, including sending nudes? Now going back to the jail letters, obviously there's a lot of dispute over who wrote these jail letters, right? But ultimately, nothing in those letters say anything about this not being self-defense. Nothing. And Hosanna told you as part of her testimony that Baby Joker is Stacy's gang name, right? She told you that Baby Joker was Stacy told you, that Baby Joker was what the other girls in the pod at the jail started calling her after she arrived to the jail. Not a gang name. Logic and common sense tells you that if she was in a gang, in the past 4 years, Detective Burrows, the gang unit, would have figured it out, been able to bring you in a picture, tell you the gang name, show you a picture of her in colors. She's not in a gang. And if she was in a gang and she did go by Baby Joker before October 3rd, then where is a single Facebook message or communication between Stacy and anyone where she signs Baby Joker? Ever. Let's talk about now Hosanna's description of the progression of the events. And there's been a lot of back and forth on this. You heard that Ms. Varela's proffer was 7.5 hours long. And you heard that it wasn't until about 1 hour and 42 minutes into her proffer that she told Detective Burrows that Stacy grabbed the beer bottle, went to smash it on Mr. Dickerson's head, and that's when she told Stacy, "No, don't do it." Stacy disregarded her and smashed it on Mr. Dickerson's head again. And then, so 2 times. And then 2 hours later, it's something different. Then there's this missed attempt. And then there was, Christopher may have been also trying to get a bottle. And then there's debate as to whether, in Hosanna's mind, whether or not Stacy used 1 bottle or 2 bottles. It could have been the same bottle. The point is, it's hard to keep your story straight, even in the same proffer interview, when it's not the truth. That's the point. Just like she described the different moments and her inability to keep it straight when Mr. Dickerson is yelling, "Get out of my house." Remember, to Mr. Burrows, she said that after the bottle was smashed on his head, that was when Chris yelled, "Get out of my house." But yet she takes the stand and tells you something completely different, right? She tells you that after Stacy pushes him off of her, that's when he yells, "Get out of my house." And of course that had to change. It had to change because their theory is that Mr. Dickerson apparently was knocked out at the time because of the high BAC and the head injury. Well, you certainly couldn't have been yelling then after she smashes him in the head to get out of my house, right? And honestly, the bigger problem with Hosanna's description of events leading up to Mr. Dickerson's death is it simply just does not match the physical evidence. It doesn't. There's been a lot of discussion about the broken glass, right? Use your common sense. If you hit someone with a glass beer bottle, with this, you are going to end up with a large chunk, not tiny shards of glass that can't be tell the difference as the arson investigators and officers are scooping through it and sifting. Then there was this weird kind of testimony by Detective Blair. The prosecution was trying to get him to say that he couldn't tell the difference between brown, dark brown Budweiser bottle glass and clear glass that was ashy and wet. We brought in that picture from that evidence viewing. Common sense tells you, you can tell the difference between a clear glass from a window that's dirty with black soot and that. Regardless. The bigger problem is the lack of injury to Mr. Dickerson's head. Because we recognize Mr. Dickerson's face is not there anymore. She's not getting up there and denying tampering with a deceased body. She's not. At no point was anyone trying to say that there was lacerations or cuts to his face. No. You heard Dr. Burson testify that he does a systematic layer by layer approach to his autopsies. He even showed you how despite the skin on the neck being burnt off, he was able to go layer by layer by layer, and you saw the pink. And he was able to show you the injuries. He did the same thing on the head. He testified that he even was able to still see hair, that he does the scalp, and then he does the meninges, and then it goes down and down. And he also testified that this type of injury, when someone's smashed in the head with a bottle, it's a blunt force trauma to the head. And that would have caused hematomas, skull fractures, contusions of the scalp, hemorrhages. Those are all abnormalities and signs of injury underneath the burnt part of the scalp. None of that. He testified that there was absolutely no evidence of any abnormality to support any injury to Mr. Dickerson's head. And that's because the physical evidence just does not support or corroborate what Hosanna told you happened. Also, just like Hosanna's word is the government's only evidence to support their theory that this couldn't be self-defense, and also that Stacy stole the ring, the debit card, and the phone. Remember that? She testified to you all under oath more than once that she saw Stacy rummaging through Mr. Dickerson's pocket as he laid there dead and gargling on his blood, right? She testified under oath that she saw Stacy steal a wallet. This wallet. She told you under oath that she saw this being taken from his pocket. That's not true. It's just not. Then there's also the claim that Stacy stole the Walmart gift card that she later used to purchase bleach, which we know she's not allergic to. She worked at the COVID sanitation of JBS. That's not true. But she went to Walmart, paid for the bleach with a stolen gift card, right? The stolen one Walmart gift card. Then how do you explain the $100 master gift card, the other Walmart gift cards in here, the 8 other gift cards in here? Why would she go through the trouble of rummaging through his pocket to steal something and only take one thing? Then there's the phone. right? She claims Stacy took 2 phones, stole 2 phones. Mr. Burrows testified that none of Chris Dickerson's family members ever said that there was ever more than 1 phone taken. Again, another point of exaggeration, right? But I submit to you, who do you think really took that phone? You heard that the Google locations had the last known registered location of that phone 2 blocks from Hosanna Varela's grandmother's house. We don't know if the ring was there. We don't know if the phone was there. Why? Because they did not ever get a search warrant for that house. And Mr. Burrows got up here and gave you a story about how, well, I have to have belief that that's there. It's a dead person's phone 2 blocks from where you know, and you wrote in your summary. You knew Hosanna Varela's grandmother lived 2 blocks away. You get the search warrant because you know what? You're accusing someone of first-degree murder. You're accusing a 19-year-old girl of first-degree murder. You get the search warrant because it doesn't hurt to. You don't get penalized. Then there's the ring. Common sense tells you, you can't burn a diamond ring. You can't burn metal. Also, we don't even know where that ring was leading up to October 3rd. Alan Dickerson testified that he knew his son was engaged. They didn't really talk about it. He knew he got the ring back. He knew he had seen it there at some point. But we also know there's an SD card in that box. There has been absolutely no evidence that that ring was there to even be taken. And I would also point out to you, who do you think had more incentive to take that? The person, the 19-year-old girl who has a family to go to, a place to live in, a car, a job, or her co-defendant who got fired months beforehand, has no income to support her children, whose car got repoed, who got kicked out of her family member's house, who isn't working. Ultimately, when you take a step back and look at the whole picture, just like we spoke about at jury selection, all of this matters, all of it, because the only evidence they have is that girl's word. And as the judge explained to you in jury instructions, not only does the prosecution have the burden of proving that Stacy had intent to kill, and after deliberation, and after time for reflection, and after judgment, but there's more. There's an added layer. Self-defense makes their job harder, because now they also have to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Stacy did not act in self-defense. They have to convince you that you are firmly convinced that what Hosanna Varela told you was the truth. And you have to consider her motivation. The law tells you that. You heard from Miss Mary Claire Mulligan. Of course she's a defense attorney, right? She's not sitting at our table. Of course she's a blind expert. But she explained to you that with 33 years of experience, state courts, federal courts, that the proffer that Hosanna did, that's what this looks like. Proffers are given when they have a hole in their case that they need to fill. Detective Burrows even went in and told Miss Varela, I have a hole. I don't know what happened inside the house. And she told you, Miss Mulligan did, that it would be unethical and against a lawyer's legal duty to do no harm to their client, to walk a client into a police department accused of first-degree murder and give a 7.5-hour proffer about how they were there and what they did and not get any benefit from it. That's just not logical. You would never pay an attorney, you would never hire an attorney to walk you into a police department and be like, yes, officer, let me tell you about how I was there and helped burn down a house. Obviously, there was a benefit. And the problem with that, and the reason why the court instructs you that you have to consider that motivation, is because it makes someone have this carrot dangling up front of their head, or in front of them, right? Remember Ms. Mulligan explained to you that this whole proffer process, the co-defendant has to keep that person happy. They're the ones with the power, right? And so she's sitting in jail on first-degree murder, not able to bond out, thinking of her children. She has to make that person right there happy. He has the power, and he continues to have the power as she's standing up there testifying. Because don't forget, yeah, she got that 16 to 32-year deal that Ms. Mulligan testified was a phenomenal deal, coming down from first-degree murder. But then there's also part of the agreement that if she testifies as to what he considers to be truthfully and completely, then she gets to come back before this court who just heard her testimony, making herself seem like some sort of collateral victim, and say, Judge, please reduce my sentence. She could walk out next week based on that testimony. She could go home to her children next week, right? I know I've had your attention for quite some time, and this has been a long trial. It has been. I just want to finish up by pointing out that during cross-examination, Mr. McCormick asked Ms. Mulligan about how and wouldn't it be that a DA would presumably go back and evaluate whether or not a co-defendant proffered the truth? Remember that? That it would be irresponsible for a prosecutor or law enforcement to not do that. They didn't do that in this case. They didn't. If Ms. Varela is telling you that a beer bottle, a glass Budweiser beer bottle, was used to smash him in the head and you only have one in evidence, you send it out for lab testing. It's routinely done. That's what the lab is for. They will be able to tell you, is there blood on it or is there not? And if there's not blood on the beer bottle, okay, nothing changes. You only do not send out something like that for lab testing in a first-degree murder case because you don't want the truth. You don't. Ladies and gentlemen, there's just way too much red flags and inconsistencies and dramatics with Hosanna Varela's story to ignore that. Just like, why wouldn't you get a search warrant for Hosanna Varela's grandmother's house? You're accusing a 19-year-old kid of first-degree murder, and then you stand up here and blame her for not telling Detective Hunziker in the parking lot, for not telling Detective Hunziker the truth. And then you criticize her and chastise her for having a fear of law enforcement, right? Does anyone else not see that that's true? No one at that table was ever going to believe her after she did that to Mr. Dickerson, that it was self-defense. Who could blame a 19-year-old kid for lying to the cops about what just happened? She was terrified. But when you're talking about judging her credibility and her testimony, think about the fact that she could have gotten on the stand and told you Hosanna did everything, right? She could have gotten on the stand and they don't know from the video surveillance which one person went back into the house to burn it down. Watch the surveillance. You can't tell. No one told you they can tell. She could have gotten on the stand and say, ladies and gentlemen, that was Hosanna. Hosanna did everything. I did nothing. Instead, she took the stand and she told you, I made some really bad choices. I burned the house down. Find me guilty of arson. Find me guilty of tampering with a human body. Find me guilty of the burglary related to arson. At the end of it, she got up there and she told you all that she acted in self-defense, because she did. This is not first-degree murder. It's not second-degree murder. It's just not. Again, let us take things as we find them. Let's not distort. Please find her not guilty of first-degree murder and burglary for the items from Mr. Dickerson's house. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Does the state have any rebuttal argument, please?
Your Honor, if I could just set up.
Sure.